This really is a great view from up here. So I've been sitting up front for the whole time, and you don't get to see what's behind you. My name is Al MacNaughton, and I'm a principal in the Virginia Department of Corrections, which I'm proud to say that Virginia has the lowest recidivism rate in the country. I'm not sure exactly the numbers. It's around 22% or even less. And I strongly believe that a large portion of that is because of the educational programming that we offer. I'm a little intimidated. We got so many accomplished and talented people in this room. I feel a little bit like a party crasher. But I'm very excited to have been invited, and I'm always interested in learning new information that can help me to prepare our returning citizens to go back into society and be positive and productive citizens. Today we have two presenters. We have Dr. Daniel Leeds. He's a research analyst from CNA Education. CNN.
How's that bomb correct?
Yeah. We also have Rufia Galici, assistant professor at Radford University. And as the discussant, we have the deputy director, Ms. Amy Lopez from the District of Columbia Department of Corrections. As we've done with all the other presenters, we'll have each person will come up and do their presentation. Then Ms. Lopez will have a chance to discuss it and to maybe ask some questions. Then we'll open it up to the floor for other questions, and if there's time, table discussion. So thank you all for attending.
I wanted to say, first of all, thank you to AIR and the people at PIAAC for having all of us here. Thank you for taking some of your time this morning to hear me present on this. My name is Dan Leeds. Suddenly I'm on the other side of the podium here. And I'm presenting some work that I did with three of my colleagues at CNA, Juliana Pearson, Leslie Scott, and Simone Robers. And we're looking at factors influencing the educational attainment, economic employment, economic mobility, and successful reentry of incarcerated parents. So I think that most of you probably don't need the additional background here, but the vast majority of prison inmates will return to their communities, and access to education while in prison can improve both economic and non-economic outcomes for them once they have returned. However, a lot of budget cuts have threatened the capacity for education for incarcerated individuals. The other thing that's really motivated this is that parental incarceration affects those parents' children. And in general, parental education affects outcomes for children. Now, parental incarceration can affect homelessness, depression, aggressive behavior, whether children go to prison themselves. A wide variety of incarcerated individuals have low education literacy and numeracy relative to the population as a whole. So this is potentially an area where we can make some policy changes that really make a huge difference. What we try to do here is we're looking at just creating a profile of incarcerated individuals, looking at parents of dependent children, which we define as anybody who has at least one child under the age of 18, comparing them to parents of grown children who have all children 18 years or older, and non-parents. To our knowledge, this is the first work that really has tried to look at the incarcerated population separately by each of these characteristics. What we want to look at here, and we have more in the full paper, is we want to look at individuals' pre-incarceration education, and we want to look in their enrollment in and interest in education in prison. We now are going to commence with a very large number of tables. So just to begin with a little bit of who are we talking about when we talk about incarcerated adults with dependent children, incarcerated adults with no children, or incarcerated adults with grown children. In all cases, certainly in the PIAAC data, these are very overwhelmingly male. They are more heavily minority. Generally, adults with grown children are less minority than those with dependent children or no children. The percent of each group that is African American is roughly similar. There's a big difference in the percent that's Hispanic, however. Incarcerated adults with dependent children are much more likely to be Hispanic than those without children or those with grown children. The other really big difference, as you might expect, adults with grown children are likely to be older. That's one thing that we're going to return to in a little bit because that may be driving some of what we find. That's also, I think, the only causal claim that I'm going to make today. We also see that most of them have just under a high school education on average. So again, this is an area where providing people with a high school education can have huge returns, and this is something that is potentially, hopefully, a very powerful impact for a very simple policy lever. If we look at the specific educational attainment that incarcerated individuals have upon incarceration, individuals with dependent children are more likely to have a primary or lower education than those with no children, but again, these are very small numbers. Individuals with dependent children are also more likely to have a lower secondary education than those with grown children. We see that, in general, individuals with no children or with grown children are more likely to have higher levels of education, looking at post-secondary, non-tertiary, or tertiary categories than individuals with dependent children. So individuals with dependent children tend to be more likely to concentrate in the middle band there of lower secondary, upper secondary, or post-secondary, non-tertiary. We look at individuals' education by their parents' education levels. One thing we try to get at is, do individuals with higher literacy or numeracy have better educated parents? Here we focus particularly on parents of dependent children. And as in general, we do find that parents' education is highly correlated with individual skill level. If you have higher literacy or numeracy, you're less likely to have parents with less than a high school diploma. We also find that literacy is more correlated with mothers' education levels than with fathers. So there is some evidence that each parent's education may have some impact in a different way or to a different extent. Looking at education that people receive while in prison, people with grown children are more likely to take any kind of academic course because it was required. Presumably this would be due to needing to receive a high school degree while in prison, for example. one of the more interesting things to come from this work is that individuals with grown children are much less likely than those with dependent children to take any kind of academic course in order to improve the prospects of job opportunity upon release. This is where I'm going to make my one causal claim, and I think this goes back to some of the age differences. The older someone is when they're in prison, the older they are when they're likely to be released, the less important probably a career is. If you're looking at re-entering society when you're 60 or 65, then having a job may be less of an immediate concern than it would be if you're re-entering at 30 or 35. We find the same thing if we look at basic skills or job skill courses. Individuals with grown children are much less likely to take courses because they're concerned about job opportunities upon release. But again, by and large, these are not a ton of statistically significant differences here. Next, we just take a quick look at the education level that incarcerated adults are interested in. And what we find is that adults without children are much more likely to be interested in higher education levels and less likely to be interested in lower education levels. If you're an incarcerated adult without children, you are less likely to be interested in high school equivalent degrees and more likely to be interested in a bachelor's or a master's, although some of these are statistically significant but sort of small magnitude differences. Again, individuals with grown children at the very high levels, if you look at trying to get a professional degree or a doctorate, they're more likely to be interested in those than individuals with dependent children. And they're less likely to be interested in middle grade or high school diploma or GED. How the course is offered, I think, probably has something to do with the type of education that people are interested in. Individuals who have dependent children are less likely to be interested in courses from a four-year college or a community college, more likely to be interested in a high school or vocational two-year program. Again, that goes back to these individuals are probably more interested in getting a high school degree or getting a certificate, and so a high school or a vocational two-year school is probably going to be the more appropriate venue. However, we also have a lot of other outcomes, which is one area that probably could use some additional explanation. Then two of the slides that to me were among the most interesting are reasons why some people said they weren't interested in an academic course or in a job skill course. There are some cases where people list educational qualifications. Individuals with no children or grown children are more likely to say they don't meet educational qualifications than those with dependent children. And individuals with no children or grown children are more likely to say that they don't want to give up a job assignment. But the two things that are really interesting to me are, first of all, relatively few people are saying that these courses are not useful. So people do really have an interest in furthering their education, but there's almost half of respondents who don't give an answer that falls into any of the categories in the questionnaire. If we look at basic skills courses, again, we see a good number of people who say that they're not eligible, but we also have a lot of people who don't give an answer appearing on the questionnaire. I think some of this is probably they're approaching the questionnaire. The questionnaire is being designed by people who think like I do. They're economists. They think, well, in terms of what are rational reasons why people would not want to pursue a degree. Well, is it because of education level? Is it because they don't want to give up a position, when in a lot of cases there are probably a lot of factors contributing to this that simply aren't operating quite on that level? So just to get into some of the implications, first of all, incarcerated individuals, regardless of parent status, need more skill building opportunities. A lot of them are very interested in job opportunities after prison and see education as a way of furthering that goal. And I think we really need to get at, why are some incarcerated individuals uninterested in education? Close to 25% say that they're not interested in academic courses. The PIAAC questionnaire doesn't really capture why this is the case. And targeting courses to appropriate education levels will reduce some of this problem, but it won't solve it. So I think we really need to get into why are some people uninterested in these courses? And I think that that's a major topic for future research. So for anyone who wants to get in touch with me after the conference to talk through some of these issues or potential future research directions, here's my contact info. Please feel free to reach out, and I look forward to hearing feedback both from everybody here and from Ms. Lopez.
Good morning.
Morning.
If you were in DC Department of Corrections, I would never accept that. We're more of a good morning kind of group. I really appreciate being here today, and I also want to thank you guys for the privilege of reading your work and being able to discuss it. Not nearly enough time for all the thoughts I had about what you wrote. I have one foot squarely in the research world, so I conduct studies, I contribute to studies. Lord knows I read a lot of studies, so I can wear that researcher hat. My other foot is squarely in the world of practitioner. So I am generally, my career is being invited into secure environments to build an educational program or a school district inside a secure environment. And so 80% of the time, the rest of my body follows that foot. So I was trying to think today about how to be the most helpful. So if you two are amenable, I will talk a little bit about the research, what resonated with me, maybe what resonated with me less, and then always back to an practicality. Sound good? All right.
That's great.
Both of these papers did an excellent job of setting the background. I love that you took the time to contextualize your research in this broader picture of a lot of what we talked about in our keynote this morning and the panel before about what incarceration, this morbid fascination we have in the U.S. with incarcerating our fellow citizens. And both papers did a great job of setting that background and then weaving in also the background of what we know about correctional education. So you set a great stage for your studies. So really think about this data that 95% of the 2 million people we incarcerate come home. So if anybody's out there thinking that we've incarcerated 2 million murderous felons that will rot away in a cell and we'll never have to, deal with them again, it's not true. These are our community members. They're our families. They're our children, our parents, our aunts, our uncles, our tias, our tios. These are our nieces, nephews. These are people that we will embrace when they come home. And if you don't have a family member, which is sort of staggering to me that anybody doesn't have someone in their life who's been incarcerated, then you need to know that they're also your neighbors. And so we just have a moral obligation to assist however we can. And the bulk of these, we've already talked about today, but the bulk of these folks don't have a high school credential when they go into incarceration. And we know from the research that low literacy skills and low employability skills not only contribute to this high rate of incarceration, but also the increasingly high rate of recidivism, which I think a lot of folks think recidivism and just people that get reincarcerated. But remember, these are people that may have a parole revocation, even a technical or a minor revocation, or they've been rearrested but not reincarcerated. So these numbers are huge, and we know that low literacy skills contribute to that. We've talked a lot this morning about the RAND Corporation's 2013 report on the effectiveness of correctional education in post-release outcomes and recidivism. And both of these papers had a nod to all of that great research. And what that research says is that our returning citizens who participated in correctional education lowered their chances of recidivism. So to me, that to still have any kind of argument that education makes a difference is just insane. Although we just keep trying to have it. So I appreciate that we plug away at this research, right, and really try to drill down to how could we improve and increase our educational programs with all this information. Both of these papers that we'll be discussing on this panel did just that. So I'm going to start with Daniel's paper. The authors there posed about 9 research questions around factors influencing correctional education programming and the successful reentry of returning citizens who are parents. The statistics in this paper were impactful and just quite staggering. 2.7 million children have an incarcerated parent. 53% of all the folks that we incarcerate are parents. And I think the one that tugged at me the most was that a child of an incarcerated parent is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated themselves than a child who doesn't. If that doesn't say we need to pay attention to what we're doing in our carceral spaces in the U.S., I don't know what does. Daniel, I would just say that we hired a fellow this year from Howard University. Her name is Dr. Bahia Muhammad, and this is her area of expertise, and I would love to sit in a room and listen to the two of you talk. Yes? Yeah.
That sounds good to me.
She's amazing, and your research was right in line with her passion, and I think you two would change the world. I would love to hear that. If you do that, can you please invite me? Just saying. You want in? Okay, all right, we're in. All right.
You need to give me your contact information.
Oh, I'm going to give you her contact information.
You have some control over that.
Yes. I invite you to the DC DOC to come visit. Also just one thing that I didn't write in my notes, but from your presentation when you talked about the older demographic and how they're less interested in education. So when I was in Texas, we did a lot of studies we were trying to figure out where to spend our money, right? You have limited amounts of resources. And what we found is that if you were over 35 and you'd been incarcerated more than 3 times, you really weren't worth the money. Because the chances of you getting out and staying out were so slim, or doing anything. I mean, this research was just so depressing. And so suddenly there were no resources aimed at this older demographic to help them get a career when they got out. So I agree they may not be interested, but does that give us the right to say, well, we're just going to write them off and let's focus on these youngins, right? Which the youngins need it too. But I loved that in your presentation. I missed that in the reading, so I'm glad to hear you say that. The study's topic is one of great need in our field. Incarceration is an intergenerational illness. It passes itself down unless we make a concerted effort to change it. Thank you for tackling that. I would say something that didn't necessarily resonate with me, or that I would like to see different, is 9 research questions for an 18-page paper, because I think there are about 18 pages of tables too. That may have been a little ambitious. I would have liked to have seen you delve into a couple and really explore them, but as I was making that note when I was reading, you did it, because you said in your future research you had these great ideas for future research with that data. So I hope that you out there read Dr. Leeds' paper and you guys take up that torch, because it was those suggestions were great. Thank you for your work. The other paper was the influence of correctional education skills and lifelong learning on social outcomes, and this was Rafia's paper. There were so many points in the study that intrigued and resonated with me, Rafia. Okay, so I'm going to say that I was amused by your finding that in the household population, that the higher a person's literacy level, the lower their social and political trust. Because I have to admit that when I read, and the more I read and understand, the lower my political trust is as well. And then it was intriguing to me that it was the opposite in the prison population. Like the more they learned, the higher their social trust got.
No,
it was the opposite.
Yes.
So I would say that in a prison, in a correctional classroom, it's the perfect incubator for safe and brave conversations, right? It's the perfect place to sit and talk about political efficacy. And because that, I will say that my students know more about what's going on politically than I do. They know more about their rights and they know more about the laws, and they really study that. And it's unfortunate that we, as educators, we don't capitalize on that and use them, when they get out with that. But it also reminded me of when I grew up in the Bible Belt. You could probably tell that from the accent. I'm not a D.C. native. But when I was a little kid, I remember this man visited our church, this older man, and he asked me what I wanted to be. And I think I said something really clever like educator and research nerd, even at like the age of 8 or whatever. And he said, if you get a PhD, you'll be an atheist. Because the more formal education you have, the less you can believe. And that data sort of reminded me of that, right? Because, yes, the more we learn and the more we can conceptualize and contextualize what we learn, the more we question. Yes, we do. And that's a good thing. It also reminded me that it's our duty as practitioners to mitigate that low social and political trust. The more they learn and the more they question, we want that trust to go higher, or at least to say, you don't trust it, get out and change it. You be the change, right? That these are the folks that can change it. I appreciated that. It was. I also appreciated that you took these traditional variables of correctional education, but you examined them through the lens of social outcomes. It was a really unique approach, and it's something we don't talk a lot. We talk a lot about GEDs. We talk a lot about reading. Holy cow, I'm Southern, y'all. Talking fast is hard. A minute left. Okay, I'm gonna give it a best shot. And we talk about getting a welding job, right? Getting a trade, but we don't talk about social outcomes. I loved that you tackled that. Okay, I would say that from a practicality standpoint, I was unclear on some of the relationships. For instance, the numeracy and help. When you explained it, I got it. From the paper, I was like, well, I'm not sure. Kind of a little head scratcher. Maybe you could develop that because it was really intriguing when you talked about it. And I would say that if you were going to sit in a room of correctional leaders and you tried to convince them to spend more money on educational programming by saying, oh, they'll have better social outcomes, they would listen politely and then chuckle when you left, right? And about the time I was thinking that, you brought it right back down because you and your co-author said, if to correctional organizations, if you have limited resources, then we recommend you spend it on, what did you recommend?
Skill development.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I think both papers could have taken these ideas and left them in this ethereal idealism, right? And instead you led us there and you let us think about it, and then you brought us right back down to what's going to help the most and what's practical. And this is not wasted research. I'm giving it to you, and this is practical. I really appreciated that about both papers. If you have the opportunity to read these papers, I really encourage you to. They're unique perspectives on a subject that we talk about a lot. And again, just thank you so much for taking the time to do the research.